My name is Maya Ellis, and I still have the coffee stain on the corner of my graduation invitation. A stupid little fingerprint from the night I worked the cafe's late shift, folding napkins, counting change, and telling myself that someday the ceremonial stage would be mine. I tell you that because small, stubborn details tend to anchor the things that try to float away. The smell of frying oil, the scrape of a chair on linoleum, the exact thud of my heart when I realized my parents weren't coming. The text arrived 10 minutes before the ceremony began. Can't make it. Lily needs us. We're so proud of you. I read it 3 times, every time as if repetition might change the meaning. The auditorium, a long bowl of pale faces and steroids of flashbulbs, went on like a tide. People were hugging. Flowers were being passed. I stood among my classmates in the black robes that had cost me 2 months' wages and felt the world become a stage set in which I had been left to act without direction. They skipped my graduation for my sister. Not because of illness, not because of an accident, not because of anything anyone would forgive. They skipped it because Lily, my younger sister, had decided she needed them. Mapleton is the kind of town where you learn 2 things by the age of 12. The high school football team's schedule and how deeply people buy into the idea of family rituals. Graduations are a religion there. You did not miss them. You did not let traffic or rain or anything less than an ambulance stop you from sitting in the 3rd row seats and clapping for the kid you raised, loved, fussed over. You showed up. But my parents did not show up. Their car was not at the curb. Their faces did not appear between the banners. For a woman who had spent nights studying with a mug of burnt coffee and hands that bled from labor, the emptiness felt like betrayal laid out in the open. When the dean called my name, Maya Ellis, Bachelor of Arts, I walked across the stage and felt dizzy. I scanned the crowd. There were faces, eyes, cameras, and somewhere an empty space where my parents should have been. The auditorium clock ticked. My diploma was thin as a plate in my hands. I smiled for the photographs, and for the moment. You learn that dignity is sometimes the small performance of a person who refuses to be ruined by others. Later, I learned the reason. My sister had what they called a breakdown. Her boyfriend hadn't answered her texts. She felt abandoned. She wanted to be held. My mother, who had been the sort of person to wear baked casseroles like armor, chose to be at Lily's side instead of mine. My father, who had worked 2 jobs and liked the quiet of his evening paper, took his cues from her. Suddenly, a lifetime of my quiet competence was invisible. I didn't shout that day. I didn't throw a scene. I collected the sting and folded it into action. I called my mother once, then hung up. I called my father and was told, gently, that Lily needed them more. "You don't understand," my father said, as if I was an untrained animal. "She's vulnerable right now." Vulnerable. I heard the word as if it were a verdict. That night in my apartment that smelled faintly of reheated pasta and the cigarettes of the neighbor downstairs, I packed a small bag. Not an escape bag, but a precisely rational thing. My laptop, the diploma still in its cardboard sleeve, a sweater. I called my friend Jenna and asked if I could stay on the couch for a couple of nights. She said yes because Jenna's kindness has always been louder than mine. Cutting family off is rarely one fiery act. It's a calendar of small silences. I stopped answering calls. I muted their group texts. I stopped showing up to family gatherings that began with a tentative "we miss you" and ended in never acknowledged slights. People think the finality of such decisions is dramatic. Often it's banal. You gradually stop feeding a machine that has been keeping you small. For months, the house on Elm Street became a place I inhabited only in memory. The holiday table, the smell of herb turkey, the ornament that had my name engraved on it when I was 9, all of it became relics. The first Christmas without them visiting felt cleaner than I expected. There were no forced smiles, no careful staging, no pretending. There was emptiness and the soft, terrible freedom of having no one present to be disappointed by. But betrayal, especially the kind that tastes like familial habit, has a way of branching. The loneliness that crept in was not only because of absent parents. It was because the people closest to me who once felt like allies turned out to be relays in an unspoken conspiracy to ignore me. My boyfriend Graham, steady, the kind of man who once fixed the squeak in my apartment door, began to pull away in small measures. He had always been good at being reasonable. When I confronted him about the distance, he told me about overheard comments, about how Lily felt, in ways that made me feel oddly defensive of a sister who had never returned the favor. It was worse than distance. A year after my graduation, I found message threads I should never have seen, photos sent from my sister to Graham, texts that began with, "You're the only one who understands," and ended with, "She won't notice." There were lines where she described my anxiety problems like an anecdote, and where he replied with a laugh emoji. It wasn't infidelity that day, it was something more corrosive, collusion in diminishing me, in making my interior life public and trivial. I remember standing in the kitchen with my hands shaking, my phone small and heavy in my palm. I felt as though someone had opened my rib cage and was cataloging my bones. When I confronted Graham, he didn't realize the gravity. "I was trying to help," he said, eyes wide like a child who has been caught taking cookies. "I wanted to understand how to be better with you." To be better with me, he'd been texting my sister details of my private fears and turning them into mockery. To be better, he'd allowed her version of me to be more credible than my own. I packed his things into a shoebox and left them at his doorstep the way you leave decency in front of a house. A small gesture to show there is a difference between someone who stays and someone who damages what they love. If the first cut was the absence at the stage, the second cut was the knowledge that even the person you slept next to could be on the other side of the mirror, looking in and laughing. After that, I stopped being on autopilot. I began to collect evidence of behaviors, of patterns, not to torment anyone, but to understand the architecture of the betrayal. Who in this small town had been telling which version of me? Who had sided with habit and with convenience? And who had stood with me? I made lists. I wrote dates. I recorded conversations in places where it was legal to do so. I took screenshots and kept receipts. There's an odd piece in cataloging things. It turns chaos into data and gives you a map. People told me to forgive. People told me families heal in time. People told me that I was being dramatic. Forgiveness is not a light switch. It is a decision that is sometimes based on merit and sometimes on necessity. I realized that I did not need to be the kind of daughter who waited to be noticed. I needed to be the kind of person who noticed herself. Building a life without their constant commentary was exhausting, but it was mine. I saved money. I enrolled in a master's program that had always felt like the polite, distant ambition in the corner of my life. I made a habit of attending lectures and opening my mouth during discussions until my opinions became part of the room. And then came the thing that demanded more than silence or distance. A year and a half after the graduation, a notification popped up on my phone. My mother had posted a lengthy status about how families must support one another, a contrite piece smeared with platitudes. She had tagged my sister in it. She had not tagged me. I could have ignored it. I could have let the algorithm slide. Instead, I called Jenna, and then my cousin, Marcus, who still lived in Mapleton and liked to think of himself as neutral. I asked them if they had noticed the financial irregularities that had started to appear in family stories. New credit cards, sudden loans that transformed into help, and other small transfers that had always been explained away as, "We're helping Lily get on her feet." Marcus, bless him, had always hated lies disguised as charity. He said he'd been wondering about some strange checks his father had mentioned. I decided then that this wasn't only about being left at a graduation. It smelled like a systematic pattern where Lily's needs were prioritized to an extent that had consequences for every other person near her. Maybe it was emotional favoritism. Maybe it was deeper. I wanted proof. So I did the thing that university studies had only mentioned in footnotes. I started to look. I requested copies of archived family listings I could publicly access. Property records, names on the mortgage for the house I had grown up in, the way checks shifted, who had been added to whose accounts. Marcus did me favors at town hall. Jenna listened to me read email drafts aloud. I hired a small legal consultant, an affordable one, not the kind of lawyer who exits limos, and asked how to check for name transfers, for assets moved without consent, for the legal language that hides greed beneath care. What I found, contrary to the cozy choreography they had performed at church and at barbecues, was a trail. Title transfers where one name vanished and another appeared. A line item where payments were redirected. Forms my parents had signed that I hadn't known existed. It wasn't overt theft in a dramatic cinematic way. It was small, administrative, banal paperwork that accumulated into a theft of acknowledgement, the erasure of the things that made me a partner in decisions about our home and our family. That knowledge is a dangerous thing. Once you know, you can't unknow. You can't let polite apologies be the final word. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a sheaf of printouts and a cup of coffee gone cold, feeling the acoustic of my life change. I had two options: call them, have a civilized talk, and pretend I was the daughter who would take a soft apology. Or I could use the language my parents respected, the language of consequences. I composed a plan. I would not humiliate them in public. I am no person for blowing up lives on social media for the spectacle. But I would also not allow the erasure to continue without challenge. I would contact a lawyer, a no-nonsense person who knew property law in small towns. I would request audits where possible. I would demand an accounting at my parents' house. I would, in short, make the unspoken visible. The day I told my mother, I did it over coffee at a diner an hour outside Mapleton. Her face was folded with the tired geography of someone who had learned to hide. She reached for my hand, a reflex of mothers that had not served her well. "We can fix this," she said, voice small. "We didn't understand. We were doing what was right for Lily." "You didn't understand my graduation?" I said. "You didn't understand how it felt to be erased?" I kept my voice steady, practiced. I had rehearsed this conversation like a lawyer's cross-examination, but it felt more like pruning a vine that had overgrown the fence and strangled a flower. My mother made the kind of noise people make when they're trying on a story that will get them out of trouble. "She's fragile, Maya," she said. "You know she is." "I know she's fragile," I replied. "I also know you wrote my name off." I slid the stack of documents toward her, the plain white printouts with redactions that only looked red until you read them. "Tell me how the house title lost my name." She read, very slowly. Tears welled up, because that's the drama we were trained to accept as an emotional currency. Her first impulse was to excuse, then blame, then bargain. I had expected these moves. I had a lawyer's number in my phone and appointments that could begin at once. The climax, when it came, was not in throwing documents at a Christmas table. It was in the calm efficiency of legal procedure. Once I filed for an accounting and for restoration where appropriate, the family was confronted with the reality of their choices. There were mediation sessions that smelled of coffee and fluorescent lights. There were times my father wore frustrated silence, and my mother clutched rosary beads like armor. There were hearings where I sat, not furious but precise, and explained the history of small erasures until the judge's face stopped being politely interested and started being alarmed. I didn't win every battle. The wheels of small-town justice ground in both directions, but I did something more important. I made the theft visible. I reclaimed my ownership where it had been altered, and in doing so, I forced accountability. My parents did not confess with the melodrama of a daytime drama. They confessed with signatures at mediations and attorneys who asked for checks and receipts. They apologized, at least on paper, and in some small cases restitution was made. There was fallout. Lily reacted the way that golden children often do when the stage lights fall, with entitlement that turned to bitterness. She accused me of betrayal, of attacking the only family she had. Friends in town took sides based on what they'd always seen, or what they were comfortable believing. I lost some people. I gained others. The grief of losing people by removing a bandage was real and bitter, but also honest. It's tempting to romanticize confrontation, to present it as a single moment where the truth bursts like a dam. Real life is less cinematic. You sit in conference rooms, you send certified letters, you speak to accountants and listen to pauses. But there are moments in the middle of that ordinary work when things happen that feel like fireworks. The first time my mother called me and asked haltingly if we could talk without lawyers. The day my father dropped off an envelope that had 2 checks in it, marked for my student loan. The small note from Marcus that said, "Proud of you." At the end of it, I did not get a tidy resolution. People rarely do. What I did get was clarity and a principle I could live by. That you do not owe yourself to people who make a habit of making you small. I got a return of my name where it mattered, on documents, on shared decisions. And I got a life that was unquestioningly mine. Sometimes I wonder if there was a point where things could have been different. If perhaps the family could have been taught a kinder choreography. But that thought is a luxury I no longer afford myself. I learned to move forward. The day I rehung my framed diploma in my living room, I placed it where sunlight hit it in the morning. It was a small ceremonial act of reclamation, light, paper, proof, no fanfare, no announcement, just a thing restored to its place. When people ask me how I had the courage to walk away, I tell them the truth. I didn't start brave. I started furious and tired and done with being a footnote. Courage arrived as a byproduct of necessity. I collected documents. I asked for help. I made plans and kept to them. I saved money until I could hire someone to speak the legal language for me. Courage follows action. Now, when I drive past Elm Street on my way to campus or the grocery store, the house looks smaller from the road. The tree in the front yard is less majestic than I remember. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of my mother in the window and feel the old ache of wishing things were simpler. I don't think she's irredeemable. People change, or they don't. I keep the door of possibility open in a way that doesn't compromise my dignity. I remarried the way some people learn to love again, deliberately. It was years before I trusted. My partner now, Sam, knows the contours of my life. He knows about the empty seat and about legal filings. He knows how to listen when I say, "This is important to me." He sits in the audience when I speak at conferences and claps with both hands. He brings flowers, not as a substitute for presents, but as a complement to it. I tell this story not because I want to indict my parents forever, but because I want to make a map for anyone who's been smoothed out by someone else's idea of care. The graduation they skipped was, in its smallness, a grammar lesson for me. Absence can mean choice. I chose to treat that absence as a definition rather than an accident. We are not always allowed the cinematic slams and speeches we imagine. Sometimes justice looks like photocopied documents and slow afternoons in a lawyer's office. Sometimes victory is about moving your diploma from a cardboard sleeve to a frame and letting light prove what silence tried to hide. If there is a moral I'll give you, it is this. Show up for yourself in the ways others won't. Keep records. Speak to someone who can translate emotional injury into actionable steps. You can love people and enforce boundaries. Cutting ties is not always the cruel option. Sometimes it's the only way to keep breathing. The coffee stain on my invitation is still there, a small stubborn detail. When I look at it now, I think of the smell of the cafe and the little victories it took to get here. The years of grind, the shifts, the rigorous practice of being present for myself. My parents missed my graduation. They also, indirectly, taught me how to stand when the applause was mine and the seats were empty. I clapped anyway, I still do.